So what happens if you're speaking for a longer period of time, like an hour-long presentation or a 30-minute presentation? How many slides do you need for that? So interestingly, the slide count doesn't change a whole lot for a 30-minute presentation or really even an hour-long presentation. The main difference is that you can add a couple more of your important points to the agenda. So in the 15-minute presentation, I was suggesting that you really limit your number of items to maybe 3, but you have the option of putting 5 in. Well, in a 30-minute presentation or an hour-long presentation, most likely you want to have 5 bullet points. It's one of those things that's kind of standard in that length of time for a presentation. So I would suggest that you cover 5 points. You can basically use the same technique, though, that we talked about in the 15-minute talk. Basically, you start with an introduction slide with an overview of all 5 of the bullet points. On your internal slide, you just cover the single main idea for each one of those bullets. And then, so that's basically will give you 5 internal slides. And then on the last slide, you just it's a summary slide. It's one where you're concluding your items. So you're basically just repeating what was on that first slide. So one of the cool things about this technique is that the repetition of the main concepts is actually going to increase the audience's retention of the material pretty dramatically, by the way. So for the more seasoned presenter, you can use just 3 bullet points for for a 30-minute presentation. And when you do it that way, you can just add additional kind of relevant stories to each one of those bullet points to clarify and reinforce each one of those bullets that you're making. The more that you use this technique, by the way, the easier it's going to be for you to find it's easier for you to fit your content into the correct presentation link. So basically, the first time you do this, most likely for a 30-minute presentation, you're going to want to have 5 bullet points. But as you get more comfortable with the technique, with the process, then maybe 5 or 6 or 10 presentations down the road, you might shorten it down to 3 because you're going to put more details into your presentation for each one of those bullet points. So if you find yourself rushing at the end without enough time to finish, then you can give fewer details in your stories. If you finish early, you can add more details into your examples and stories next time. So basically, it's an easy way to adjust the timing of your content so it hits an exact time frame, which, by the way, just so you know, that is a very, very elite skill for public speakers. Very few people can hit a time frame exactly. If you're given 30 minutes to speak and you can hit that 30-minute time frame at the exact moment, that's a very elite type of skill. And if you practice this technique over and over again, it can help you kind of maximize your ability to do that. So for a 60-minute presentation, then basically you want to use 5 bullet points and 7 slides, just like what we talked about. But this time you'll want to insert a couple of different stories as evidence for each one of your bullet points. I like to use this. The technique that I like is what I call the bad example, good example technique. And so basically on each one of those internal slides, you want to give your audience an example of yourself or really somebody else who did the opposite of what you're suggesting that we understand in that point, and then afterwards you kind of follow up with a good example. So I'll give you an example. I'll give you, since we're talking about examples, I'll give you an example of how you can actually use that. So, because if I were to use that specific technique to prove that you need 7 slides for an hour-long presentation, I could basically use examples to prove that. I can give you a bad example, somebody who did too many slides or too much content and it was confusing. And then I'll give you a good example of somebody who did it really, really well. So like, for instance, here's a bad example. So this actually really happened. It's very embarrassing. But a few years ago, I went to a 3-day seminar where the presenter he was teaching about how to market to universities, to colleges. And on the first morning, I was excited, by the way, about going to this seminar. It was really cool. So on the first morning, his team, the folks that were kind of organizing the seminar, they gave each one of the participants, I was just sitting in the crowd, a 3-ring binder, and it had hundreds of pages in it, right? So it's a 3-day session. So, I'm like I said, I was really excited especially as I scanned through the binder, because it was full of great information. It had During the first hour, by the way, of that session, the speaker, the main guy who was leading this thing, he came and gave in an hour, he gave like 50 great tips and techniques, 50 ways that you can market to universities better. And then in the next hour, he covered another 50. And he did this over and over and over for 2.5 days. Now, because I'm a public speaking coach, I quickly kind of caught on to what he was doing. Basically, he touched on hundreds of tips. However, he never really went into great detail on any of them. So basically, he covered way too much material for anybody to ever be able to use well. And so, I mean, this technique would be like a good analogy here would be if I introduced you to like 50 new people at a party, and then an hour later, I asked you to name all of those 50 people by sight, that would be very difficult for most of us to do. And if I added another 50 in the next hour, your retention would likely keep dropping. So basically that the technique that he was using was one that what he was given a lot of great information, but it wasn't very useful to the people who are there. So basically a lot of us just wasted a lot of money going to that seminar. Here's a better example, though. A few weeks ago, a longtime client from my company asked me to design a custom workshop for his team. And he had a team who were basically, this team was working on a project that had been discontinued. Big, huge company, have lots of different projects. This was one that they were probably hired to work on for 3, 4, 5 years, something like that. So it was a pretty extended kind of thing. But all of a sudden the funding had gotten dropped. And so basically they had a bunch of people who they'd made promises to that were going to get laid off. And so he wanted to help these team members have an easier time getting rehired elsewhere in the company, or even if they have to go outside the company, he wanted to be able to help them. So he wanted me to create a short class for them on how to do a job interview. He knew I was helpful in helping people reduce public speaking fear. And so he said, hey, can you do the same thing with a job interview? So basically, since this was kind of new, this is not something that I'm an expert on. This is not something that I do on a day-to-day basis. So basically what I did was I kind of made a list of the items that were the most important things that the people in this audience would need to know. And at the top of the list was how to reduce nervousness. I mean, that's one of the reasons why he was hiring me to do this, was because I help people reduce nervousness. And then so basically what I did in this session was I spent the first few minutes covering details about how to help people reduce nervousness. Second, I gave them a simple process to help them answer questions with credibility. And then finally, I gave them a list of questions that would likely be asked in the interview. And I could have covered hundreds of other tips. However, these were the things that would give the people in the audience the most bang for the buck. So that's what we covered. We only had a couple of hours to deliver the content. So I wanted to focus on the things that were most important, that were going to give them the most bang for the buck. And it worked really well. In fact, worked so well that he kind of put that on his, this is a brand new class that we just created. He put it on his permanent schedule. And so we're going to kind of continue to offer that to people in his company over and over again. So anyway, so basically, what you want to keep in mind for the 30-minute presentations, the 60-minute presentations, is typically about 7 slides is kind of the key concept that you want to hold on to. And if you put too much stuff into your presentation slides, you're going to be reading your content. It's not going to be as impactful, and it's not going to be as fun or easy for you to deliver as well. So basically, keep it to about 5 to 7 slides for a 30-minute to 1 hour presentation.